Okay, so hello everybody. Good morning for people from Europe and good afternoon for people from Australia or Asia, any part of other part of the world. Um, and so it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second online workshop organized by IGU Transport Geography Commission, and I'm the chair at the moment. I'm very happy to see our former chair, Fred, over there, and our current steering committee member, Dorina, who is actually the main curator of today's talk. And we are going to talk about moving forward, understanding women's reality in urban transport. So we have three speakers from Australia, and we are going to explore the intersections of gender, mobility, and transport. So I'm really looking forward to, we have three speakers, Dorina, Professor Dorina Pojani from University of Queensland, also Professor Nicole Kalms from the University of Monash, and also Kurt Iveson, and I hope I'm pronouncing right, from University of Sydney. So I'm really looking forward to it. And without further ado, I would like to welcome the first speakers. By the way, before we start, we only have 1 hour for this fascinating topic. So what we are going to do is each of them will have 15 minutes talk, and we will be able to discuss and hold your questions towards the end. And if you are free, please stay to discuss about the topic. Okay, so now I would like to welcome the first speaker, Professor Dorina Pojani, to talk about the feminist critique from a historical perspective. Please.
Thanks very much, Tia Liu, for the kind introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And like Tia Lin said, this first presentation will focus on the past, how certain ideas that we now have about transport, mobility, how we should move around in cities, how we should use urban spaces. I'll talk about how they're not recent, but they were planted in the 19th century during the so-called Second Industrial Revolution, which is the time when planning consolidated as profession. I'll base my talk around a recent book that I published with two colleagues here at the University of Queensland, Kathy and Rory. Big shout out to them. The book is called Early Planning Utopias, a Feminist Critique. I'll walk you in the presentation, I'll briefly walk you through the book, but I'll also put a mobility twist to the discussions. The book is about planning more broadly. Okay, so the starting point of the book is that, well, all the gender biases that we see in urban planning, they do not start during second wave feminism. That's when they started to be discussed, but in reality, they were present much earlier. And the early planners that started to envision solutions for the polluted industrial city, oftentimes they were well-intended. So the purpose of the book is not to throw everyone and everything under the bus, but to make clear all those patriarchal ideologies that underpin the plans. And sometimes our biases are unconscious. It's not like these early male planners intended to do harm, but they came to the profession with certain cultural preconceptions. The book talks about 20 important male planners from that era, and in making our selection, we sought to have some regional balance. We didn't want all the planners to be American or all from the UK. We wanted to include people from continental Europe, but we didn't expand beyond the North Atlantic because we felt that this is the region where planning gelled, originally gelled as a profession, but we do recognize that the ideas that were invented in this large region on both sides of the North Atlantic, then were exported to the rest of the world, either via colonization, so imposition, or sometimes voluntary borrowing. And so that's how we structured the book. We structured it by plan rather than by plan. And we divided the people into three groups, what we call the utopian visionaries, people that envisioned full cities. Another group is rational functionalists, people that did not necessarily envision full-blown utopias. They sought to fix existing cities. So maybe they designed urban extensions or improvements of existing city spaces. And then a smaller group called what we call the romantic archivists, who are people that more looked to the past. They were critical of what was happening in their own time, and they thought we should turn our gaze to the past rather than always envision this sort of perfect progressive future. All right, so what are the central themes? I mean, we discuss each planner individually, and then we have a synthesis in the book where we talk about the main themes in these early masculine utopias. So for one thing, those early utopias, they had this rigid form and very often monumental scale. So the idea that rigid geometry is king, that's when it was planted. So this plan, instead of looking at cities in terms of small scale communities living and breathing people, they thought of cities as objects that could be arranged around. These ideas that we criticize quite a lot now, like functional segregation or other types of segregation by income or by gender, those are also planted during that era. So the idea of zoning is not really a post-war phenomenon. It started much earlier, where industrial zones were separated from residences, and by separating the spaces of industry and the spaces of commerce from residential spaces, planners of that era also separated genders, because women became these angels of the house that were supposed to preside over residential space, whereas those other spaces, industrial spaces and commercial spaces, became the domain of men. In the past, everything had been much more interconnected, with production, consumption, living happening all in the same building. All of this came with this idealization of domesticity. So women had to be convinced that, oh, you're too fragile to work. The world of men is just too rough. So if you're a bourgeois woman that can afford to stay home, that's what you should be doing. I mean, you should only be working if you have no other choice. If you're so poor that you can't otherwise make ends meet. But yeah, those women can work. Anybody who has the means should just stay at home and manage the household. That's what women were born to do. And that kind of idealization had not existed in other eras either, and it had not existed in the countryside. So this was very much an urban phenomenon. Finally, we should not forget that all this early planning that happened in the North Atlantic was bankrolled by the colonial enterprises of that era. So now a lot of the world looks at, say, continental European cities with envy, or early American cities. They're these beautiful places with monumental buildings, great architecture, and public transport that started very early. But we shouldn't forget that all of these good things came to these wealthy parts of the world because other parts of the world were actually suffering and being exploited. So that's an important point to make there. So after we're done talking about male planners during the second industrial revolution, we also discuss some women that made contributions to planning at the time. They cannot be exactly called professional planners because women had very limited opportunities to work during those days. So a lot of what we might call planning, it actually happened through community organizations, sometimes on a voluntary basis, or sometimes it was in the form of housing management, a woman acting as a house manager, and in that way doing some sort of what we'd consider today social planning, for example. And the analysis shows that these early women planners or proto-planners, they had different ideas to men about what should be done to improve the industrial city. So they promoted this care-based urbanism. They prioritized daily life and community, so what was around them, rather than envisioning these abstract grand schemes. There was some resistance to patriarchal planning in looking at the small scale, and a lot of women thought up these new schemes or new approaches to deal with domestic work, domestic labor, because despite progress in that era, women were very constrained by the amount of time that caring for the household took. So some of these female planners, they came up with some amazing ideas, which we could potentially copy today, like communal housekeeping or outsourcing housework to professional organizations, houses with no kitchens at all or with no laundries, which, I mean, I don't know why we don't do that even today, and we continue to have every woman doing the same task individually over and over again. I mean, that's a lot of wasted space. So okay, so that's the context of the book. That's the overview. But what about specifically transport and mobility? This presentation is by the Transport and Geography Commission. After all, so I need to talk about those early ideas around transport and mobility. Well, let me show you some images. So this is the Ciudad Lineal, so that's a linear extension for a city, specifically Madrid. This is envisioned by Arturo Soria y Mata, Spanish planner. So you can see his idea is of these very, very wide streets separating residences. But on the positive side, he envisions these streets as incorporating public transport, trams. In the past, we had to think that residential streets had much nearer that. The monumental scale was promoted first during that time. And then nowhere was the scale more monumental than in Paris. That's the ultimate monumental city of the 19th century that then served as example to the rest of the world. So these are some of the boulevards envisioned by Baron Haussmann and his patron Napoleon III. But again, on the positive side, because these streets are so wide, nowadays they can be retrofitted easily for cycling superhighways, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So here is the Liverpool Street. This is by Patrick Abercrombie, famous planner from the British Isles. So again, very wide residential streets, not too different to those proposed for Madrid, but at least they do incorporate public transport as opposed to later when the world became all about cars. And here is David Burnham's plan for Chicago. So now moving to the other side of the Atlantic. So again, very, very wide boulevards, but because cars were just starting to appear in those days, those wide boulevards had not filled up with moving and parked cars yet. So this is from the socialist world. This is Nikolai Milutin, his ideal socialist city from the 1920s. And this is not so much to show the transport spaces. So transport is done by railroad in this case, which serves people, but also industrial needs, so freight. But this is an example that shows residential segregation or functional segregation in the city. So functional segregation is not a characteristic of the capitalist city, but it was embraced in a big way by the socialist city as well. And whatever was happening in the Soviet Union, so this is from the Soviet Union, of course, influenced the rest of Eastern Europe and even other parts of the world like East Asia, places like China and Vietnam that were socialist. Okay, so how is this relevant to today's cities? Well, like I said in the beginning, it's not as if I want to only criticize the past. There are good things in the past and bad things in the past. So I feel like we can take the good and get rid of the bad. So one way to do that is to take those wide streets that we've inherited from early planning eras and start repurposing them to incorporate more public transit and more active transit, like I show in the bottom of the slide. So the top of the slide shows a conventional street, the way we'll design, a suburban main street nowadays, where we have public transport often sharing a lane with bicycles. And then a lot of space is taken up by parked cars as well, and moving cars. And in the bottom image, what I've done is I've removed parking, and all that space that was earlier taken up by parking has now become a super highway for active transport. All right, so that's it. That's it for me. If you'd like to support this book project, please do ask your university library to purchase a copy of the book. And I've provided the link here on the slide, so you know where to do that. Thank you very much. And I'll pass it over to Chialin to introduce the other speakers who will bring this story up to date. Transport, mobility, and gender in the present.
Thank you so much, Dorina. It's really great for this overview, historical view about the cities and then how they link to transport. Now I would like to welcome Nicole from Monash University, and she's going to talk about train wreck, public transport, and women's safety. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation, Dorina. And delighted to be here. Yes, I'm going to be talking about public transport and women's safety here in Australia, but I think this applies to more broadly to most women's experiences across the world. So my name's Nicole Kalms and I lead a research lab called the XYX Lab, and many members of this team have contributed to the research that I'm sharing with you tonight. We are a research lab with architects, urban designers, planners, interaction designers, and our mission, if you like, is to think about and advocate for women and gender diverse people's experiences in the public realm. So we do a lot of work around gender sensitive placemaking, which of course relates directly to public transport. Public transport has been a large thematic area of our research agenda. We work in a co-design methodology, so we really involve people that should benefit from the work of design and architecture and urbanism in the design process. And we develop knowledge through a lot of design thinking methodologies. And of course, we share that information with communities more broadly. We've worked with lots of different partners across, I think, about 5 continents. But the research I'm drawing on this afternoon, it's evening here in Melbourne, is a Australian research project. And really what we've been thinking about and what I think we've contributed to the public transport agenda is really thinking about how we can communicate the value of gender sensitive approaches when we're thinking about public transport spaces and design for people using public transport, thinking very much about solutions in terms of design and policy. We really think that engaging with women and girls and people of various gender diversity, sexuality, ethnicity, cultural backgrounds is incredibly important, and the work can't be done without doing that. And we use an intersectional approach, and I'm going to share with you some of the toolkits that have come out of this research that are now informing the public transport service providers, not just in Australia, but internationally. And with this in mind, what we're thinking about is how the future of public transport policy development for government and service providers really has to include gender framework and consultation. And we know that that's happening. We see that embedded into the policy documents and into the design briefs that architects and urban designers are responding to, that there's a kind of mandate around gender sensitiveness. And even though we wish people were doing it as a kind of free will, we know that actually we do need to create targets and have mandates around this. Now, this isn't a new story. So we know that we've been very aware of women's mobility patterns and how they're quite different to men's mobility patterns. I know this is a really simplified diagram, but it does kind of illuminate the point, is that women often trip chain and they're juggling multiple responsibilities, often with children, and that can be quite different from that traditional commuter experience. And I think it does kind of connect what I'm talking about to Dorina's work around those kind of early cities and how we've kind of been designing in potentially a biased way. I think this diagram is also incredibly important, that the way we kind of use data in public transport is just inherently biased. And if we recalibrate some of these trips to think about what aspects of these have a gendered lens, then we would actually see the amount of work that is often designated as work that women undertake, such as caring work. It really changes the way we think about the use of public transport. Incredibly important to be really critical of the data and ways that we kind of cut the data in public transport. And so what we kind of were able to establish when we started this research at the XYX Lab is a couple of things. Firstly, that we know that we need to take a gender sensitive approach to crime prevention for environmental design. That's very different to just standard CEPTED. We have to think very carefully about a gender informed approach to crime prevention. We know that we need to create alternative means of reporting what happens on public transport, because it's, especially with things like gender-based violence, sexual harassment, assault, women are so used to having these things happen in public transport spaces that they just deal with it, and we're not capturing that information and the prevalence of it. So I think that's incredibly important. We need to increase surveillance, but that's not CCTV. CCTV is terrific for assets. It's not terrific for people. So the presence of a surveillance presence, whether that's with uniformed or plainclothes police people and services in transport, is incredibly important. We also need to tap into the use of technologies, making sure that women have access to internet and are able to use particular forms of gender sensitive apps and devices to help with their transport experience is incredibly important. And I'm going to show you also some of the ways that we think awareness campaigns can really build a culture that is telling people about how we want them to behave in public transport, which is a really evidence-based approach to dealing with this particular issue. I'm not going to step through this in great detail, but I'd encourage you to have a look at it in the video afterwards. What we have been able to really draw out of our research is the ways that the individuals experience. So just being a woman makes you more vulnerable to violence in public transport and in public spaces more broadly. And that a previous experience that's negative really impacts your whole relationship to public transport. We know that women and girls and gender diverse people share stories about public transport and different lines and systems, so they know where the bad spots are. That really affects the ways they use public transport. We know that the presence of other people really shapes the way that public transport is both used and experienced. So particularly unpredictable people, which are often in public transport spaces, and both the overcrowdedness and the lack of people really impacts how public transport is used and experienced. We also know that the spatial conditions create are very impactful. So lighting, maintenance, feelings of entrapment, again, that kind of isolation, a huge part of how experience on public transport can be good or bad. Plus, we then need to think about the staff. Often there's a real lack of staff around public transport spaces now, the reliability of service, the fact that it's kind of open access for all people and often very anonymous. If any of you have been on public transport lately, essentially everyone just has their face in a phone and no one is interested in kind of being a kind of good citizen. And so that's an issue. And then, of course, there are particular aspects of the vehicle design which can be gender bias in terms of their scale, proportion, entrapment, etc. So all of these things are incredibly important when we're thinking about the entire experience of public transport. And so as a result of some of the really horrific things that had been happening in public transport in Australia, we undertook a 3-year research project with La Trobe University and RMIT. It was commissioned by the Victorian State Government. which really starts to describe some of the outcomes of our research. Like I mentioned earlier, we engaged in huge co-design processes. So we engaged women from the community and we elevated them to experts in the room, and alongside transport stakeholders, service providers, architects, designers, and we really made them think about these issues. And that's a very deliberate methodology that the XYX Lab uses regularly. And this really informs some of the outcomes. We had a lot of insights, and a lot of them I've already mentioned already, but they really come out in some of these final images I'm going to share with you that became, I guess, a way of sharing with communities our kind of vision for where public transport could go, and the ways that we thought that things might need to kind of take shape. And these were delivered through these 4 toolkits. So what we realised is that, of course, it won't surprise many of you, urban design is not going to solve this problem. We actually need a multifaceted approach, which for us and from the research that we undertook meant that we needed to look at gender sensitive communication on public transport, gender sensitive placemaking, which is that urban design piece, gender sensitive data collection, and the training of the service providers to understand how to create a gender sensitive experience. And so there are 4 toolkits which are publicly available, which describe these in detail. I'm just going to touch on a few of them just to give you a taste of what we kind of did. So this is a tram that we not designed the tram, but designed the interface, and you'll see how this kind of comes through in the communication campaign. We really believe that the kind of communication of public value and behaviour is really important. The tram was called Yours, Mine, Ours, and it informed all of the kind of communication campaigns which followed. So we really started to design assets which showed and described women's experiences. So the stories and the interaction with these stories through advertisements in the public transport network really started to speak very carefully to the shit experiences that women and girls were having on public transport, not hiding it, really drawing attention to the fact that it was reportable and not acceptable behaviour. And so these were some of the communication messages, and these were research driven. So they related to what women wanted to share. There were very specific decisions around typography, messaging, the sharing of data, being really explicit around how timely the service was, how many women had been sexually harassed on this line, really starting to call out the behaviour and to encourage the reporting and the collection of data around public transport infrastructure in Victoria. In terms of gender sensitive placemaking, I really saw these as effective small shifts. So thinking about traffic calming measures that would encourage different forms of accessibility to transport, how built interventions might create more spaces for dwelling, and having people around public transport spaces, which can often be quite desolate. And really thinking about infrastructural changes like providing real-time data so that women and girls really know, how long they're going to be waiting, which is a huge pressure point, and how to connect up different services. We're also thinking about branding in larger scales, things like lighting and how we understand different forms of mobility, whether that's walking, pedestrians, biking, different forms of active mobility, and that last mile home. So they were also part of what we were thinking about. And also activating the local communities to help kind of activate these public transport lines. So in Victoria, we have, it's probably the same in many outer suburban areas, there are some dead zones which need revitalisation. So how could we engage communities in temporary activities to kind of help that invigoration happen and to make those public transport lines safer and more effective for women and girls? We designed a whole lot of training modules, which I won't show you because they're really boring, because they're just text, but we really embedded the training of the service providers within the network and saw that as a really active part of how we might think about public transport and the visibility of that gender sensitive training. And we really made the capacity to report issues very, very clear and central to station design within the network. And I think this is kind of the final couple of slides, but At the beginning of this research, we understood that only 18% of the data that was currently held by public transport service providers was actually high quality or able to be comparable or comprehensive or reliable. And so there was a whole piece around how to gather gender sensitive data in a way that allowed different services to compare and contrast, and actually encouraged women and girls and gender diverse people to report what was happening for them. And so this meant that there was a digital component which really started to connect up the services with things like commercial passenger vehicles and different modes of activity, and really allowed a digital interface with public transport that was productive and valuable. So like Dorina, I've also written about these things. It's a chapter in my recent book called She City, which you're more than welcome to have a look at. It details some of the things that I'm talking about. And if you're interested in the larger work of the XYX Lab, we do lots of different projects around public spaces. And again, I'd encourage you to reach out to us if there's anything that we can assist with. So thank you. I'll throw to Jillian and look forward to hearing Kurt's presentation.
Thank you so much for the wonderful project. It's really, really rich effort, a lot of work, and really nice. Without further ado, I think we all have very good time control, and now I have to welcome the third speaker, Professor Kurt Iveson from the University of Sydney, to talk about everyday equalities on Sydney's train. Floor is yours, Kurt, please.
All right, thank you. And hopefully the sharing has worked. All right, so hi everybody. Third person, I'll see if I can keep up the excellent timekeeping. But I want to quickly thank Dorina for the invite and to acknowledge the country I'm on here. I'm in Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the First Nations people on whose land I work and who never ceded their sovereignty over this space either. And I'll just say I feel a little bit like an imposter here at this session, in the sense that I'm neither a transport planner or a transport geographer, but I'm an urban geographer working on public space and urban politics, and that always seems to find myself working on public transport for reasons that are probably very obvious to everybody in this workshop. So I guess in my time today, I just want to pick up on a few points that I think Dorina's made about gendered assumptions that are built into our transport services, and also hopefully just reinforce some of Nikki's amazing work about the kinds of interventions that might effectively address some gendered experiences of transport services in my town and in others. And I've just cheekily popped up the book cover here to say that a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today draws on stuff that I've done together with Ruth Fincher and Helga Leitner and Valerie Preston, which we were focused on the nature of urban multicultures and everyday equality, which by that we mean a kind of being together in difference but as equals in cities, where equality isn't so much demanded as enacted through the formation of like egalitarian solidarities across difference that then hopefully become the basis for a more transformative political project, which is very much an approach, I guess, that we developed in dialogue with feminist political theory and geography. But I won't go into all of that, and I'll get straight into the transport stuff. Transport featured in that book because obviously it has such an important relationship to the politics of equality in our cities. And in theory, the provision of public transport ought to contribute to the equalisation of access to basic standards of mobility and connectivity for everybody in a city, regardless of their private means and their ownership of private cars. But of course, for public transport to deliver on this promise, then everybody needs access. And that access has obviously a number of related dimensions. And I want to talk briefly today about work that I've done here in Sydney about the infrastructural dimensions of that and the interpersonal dimensions of that. So, for good reason, I guess, a lot of critical research into transport inequality is focused on uneven geographies of public transport services and infrastructure. There are some very basic fundamental questions about which communities and journeys are served by public transport and which are not. And this issue certainly surfaced in work that I've done here in Sydney in collaboration with a civil society coalition called the Sydney Alliance, where the gendered dimensions of transport planning, routes and timetables really came to the fore. So for instance, in some of that work, we were working with that alliance to identify some of the gaps in the maps of our public transport network in Sydney, areas which had relatively poor public transport coverage as part of an advocacy campaign to try and fill those gaps. And you can see here in these maps, we were kind of, doing the classic geography GIS thing of mapping who was within 400 meters of public transport. And then on the right, who's within 400 meters of public transport that comes at least 15 minutes every day. But two of the unions that were involved in that alliance and that campaign, unions who represented the overwhelmingly feminized and migrant workforces of nurses and of cleaners, were very clear that for their members, the public transport network is only as good as the services that are offered outside of so-called peak hours, as their work is overwhelmingly shift work. And I guess, similarly, and in a way that Nikki's already pointed out, Jennifer Kent here in Sydney has been doing really important research about parents' experiences on public transport. And again, given the ongoing feminisation of the work of social reproduction in households, the public transport network for parents and for mums is only as good as its ability to facilitate complex journeys, not just from A to B, but from A to B to C and beyond. And as Jennifer Kent has pointed out in that work, like literally we have often in transport planning a division of trips into the so-called necessary and discretionary travel, and the services being planned for necessary trips as a priority. And a way, as Nikki said, the way that those data categories work, literally, I guess, are as classic in a case as you could get of the way that social reproduction and feminized care work is devalued in the way that we organize data and think about how we plan a system when all of that care labor that is done in our cities, often feminized, is labeled as discretionary travel rather than essential. So all those questions are sort of sitting there in the infrastructural realm, but of course, as Nikki's also pointed out, there's also alongside that, the quality of public transport as a site of encounter is also really fundamental to its accessibility. And the nurses and cleaners that I was working with were also insisting that regardless of whether we could fix those gaps in the maps, both in time and space, regardless of when and where services are provided, if they're not safe, then they're still not accessible and they still won't be used. And sorry, yikes, I've just skipped the wrong document. So all these reasons, then the atmospheres and the encounters of public transport are really happily now receiving a lot more policy and scholarly attention. And in that everyday equalities work, we were, I guess, really interested in the ways in which togetherness in difference as equals could emerge on public transport. Thinking about public transport as a site where anyone can be present, and also as a site where unfocused co-presence can maybe give way to people caring for one another across their differences and coming to one another's aid when they need it. And so for us, I guess this is about public transport being made public in a political sense, not only in terms of its ownership and who uses it, but also in the way that its atmospheres and its encounters are made the objects of public discussion and public debate. And so in the work that we did here in Sydney, we tracked a series
I don't think your slides are moving. I don't think your slides are moving. You're on public transport. Maybe you are. Sorry, shut up, Nick.
Oh, yeah. No. Cool. You're right. I just don't have many to cycle through. So like we've been, we tracked in that work a series of state and non-state interventions into the atmospheres of public transport in Sydney. And we were trying to show that enacting a form of being together in difference as equals on public transport isn't just a matter of like passively sharing a train or a bus with different others and behaving well. We tried to show how on public transport, as in other urban contexts, like being together in difference as equals requires care and sometimes hard work and sometimes agitation. And like, I guess comparing like what we saw in Sydney with the work that Nikki has been doing with transport authorities in Melbourne, I think is really instructive here, hopefully. That we were tracking some of the New South Wales government's work to try and improve what they called the customer experience of public transport here in Sydney. that happened often through these public communication campaigns in the spaces of public transport itself. And what's most striking about the customer experience interventions that we examined here is that they studiously ignored or avoided explicitly addressing questions of sexism and racism. And instead, there was an overwhelming focus on specifying and promoting what was called customer courtesy and identifying antisocial behaviour that has very little connection to any political questions of being together. So these media initiatives sought to improve the experience of public transport by specifying, naming and shaming various forms of antisocial behaviour that might inhibit a trouble-free sharing of the space of a train carriage or a bus, backed up in situ by constant audio and textual reminders of the ever-expanding surveillance technologies on the network. And just to pick up on one of Nicole's points, all this happened at the same time that ticket officers and platform staff were being cut to shreds through neoliberal agendas in our transport planning. Now, like undoubtedly, some of the forms of so-called beastly behaviour that are identified in the poster campaigns and in the media interventions are certainly a cause of annoyance, perhaps to some and many public transport passengers. But in conceptualizing the public of public transport through the lens of a kind of universalized and undifferentiated customer, these initiatives made no reference at all to the particular forms of bad behavior, like sexism, like racism, that are regularly experienced by particular passengers, nor did they articulate any vision or ideal of what might be a good way of being together on the network, much less one informed by any notion of equality or justice. And worse still, actually, these customer courtesy initiatives actually have the potential to give license to some of the very forms of harassment that are reported by passengers in studies of everyday transport use. So, for instance, notions of antisocial behaviour are frequently filtered through racist and other stereotypes. So, for instance, while a conversation among a group of passengers in English may go unnoticed, a conversation in a language other than English can often be perceived by some people as being noisy, quote, or loud, so that posters that shame loud talkers can take on a different and really problematic, in fact, meaning in that kind of context. And another more notable feature of those interventions is that they take the form of a one-way assertion of public authority rather than attempting to facilitate public discussion and debate. But of course, passengers aren't simply passive readers of these communications, and indeed they're increasingly making use of their own media technologies to produce their own mediations and messaging around the public transport experience. The widespread ownership of smartphones has seen a surge in passengers capturing and posting instances of sexist and racist abuse on public transport here in Sydney and around the world. And those videos are often remediated by mainstream media. And that's certainly contributed to an ongoing public discussion about the norms and publicness of public transport. So the book goes into a whole bunch of examples of those that I probably don't really have time to talk about in any depth. But I guess we can possibly all imagine the kinds of things I'm talking about. These are the instances where people are just literally holding up their phone and capturing somebody abusing them, or being a bystander and intervening in a moment of harassment or abuse by, capturing and surveilling in real time what's going on and then remediating that. And like the key to that kind of intervention, I think the two things we tried to highlight in the book. One is that in contrast to the surveillance cameras that, as Nikki said, are great at protecting assets, the passenger-on-passenger surveillance that can go on at least is also an intervention in the time space of gendered or racialized harassment and encounter. It's a form of witnessing that intervenes in the moment. It doesn't just capture it, but it hopefully changes the dynamics. And secondly, of course, what it does is to try and create a public and a political discussion about forms of inequality and equality on public transport. Yeah, I mean, I guess in the spirit of trying to keep things to time, probably where I feel like bringing all that stuff together has my head at anyway in terms of a conversation is to just suggest that in thinking about tackling gendered inequalities, how we keep together our studies of routes and timetables and maps with our studies of encounters and experience and atmospheres, I think is really challenging but really important. And again, I think, in different ways, Dorina and Nikki have both spoken to that much better than I have. But just thinking about how we connect the infrastructural and the interpersonal and holding those two things together seems really important. And secondly, thinking about how we politicize these issues and how our research can try and support that politicization through the kinds of co-designed research work that Nikki's doing, or through doing the kind of collaborative work, hopefully, that we've been doing here in Sydney with the Sydney Alliance. I think there are models to sort of translate and take that research out into the world and intervene in the spaces we're trying to reshape. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. I think we have very, very good time control. We have 15 minutes left. And thank you so much for Kurt to share the experiences from Sydney as really wonderful experience sharing as well, and to raise the awareness of this. So I think we have 15 minutes for questions. And please feel free to, turn on your camera to ask questions yourself. And I have seen 2 questions already from the chat box. The first one is from Professor Nassima Baran, and to ask about Dorina from the historical religious perspective. Would you like to ask yourself, Nassima, please?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all the free presentations. They're really inspiring, and I'm thrilled of this conference. Yes, the cover illustration is marvelous. So it was your first slide, and it's really. But maybe you can develop it or say where it's come from and why did you choose it?
Yeah, I'll explain. So we didn't talk about religion in the book as such, but because we focused on the North Atlantic, most of the countries followed Christianity. Would have been either Protestant religion or Catholicism or Orthodoxy, either the Eastern Orthodoxy or Southern. But the book cover shows there is this town in Tuscany in Italy called Gimignano, and the image represents the saint patron of the town. So it's a medieval image. It's in a church in this town, and this is actually a typical representation. I mean, sometimes you find it in Catholic churches where the saint patron of the town holds a model of the city. So in his lab, but I have found versions also in Southern Orthodox churches in the Balkans, similar representations to the saint patron holding the city, and we chose it because we thought it was sort of a perfect representation of the patriarchy in urban planning. So that's the context. It doesn't mean that we covered religion in the book as such. Is meant to represent the patriarchy.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think there's another question from Bettina to ask Nicole about autonomy. Would you like to share your questions, please?
Well, I think Nicole has actually answered that in the chat, so I don't want to take up unnecessary time.
One thing I will say, just to extend on it, so it's a question about autonomy and choice, but one of the interesting things that many of you may or may not know is that often one of the first things that a young woman will do if she's financially able is buy a car. And so this kind of question, and I mean, then that commitment then has other consequences financially for her, etc. And so I think even women who say they don't think about safety, if you dive deeply into them with a evidence-based research methodology, they're constantly mitigating a sense of perceived risk. And so that kind of planning takes up a lot of emotional work around where will I park, what time will it be when I get home. Often women and girls are sharing their location with family members, which introduces a whole other kind of digital surveillance, which we wish we didn't need to kind of undertake. So I think that autonomy and choicing is a huge part of the desires that particularly young women have around their experiences of being in the public realm, but particularly being on public transport. And then one other thing that I think is really interesting, and I wonder if others have had this experience, we did a lot of work with service providers and we were talking a lot about safety. And it took us, I don't know how long to work out that when we were talking about safety, they thought we were talking about trip hazards and, like technical safety. And, and so these are the barriers. It's enormous to really kind of bring together that engineering infrastructural mindset. Think about how they'll be responding to, what did Kurt say? I love this kind of passenger on passenger intervention. Like conceptually, that is so tricky for them to get their head around. So we've got a lot of work to do to draw these affective and technical things together. And I completely agree with Kurt. That is where this is going to make change, is holding both of those things and working on both of those things like parallel.
Thank you. I just it's a great opportunity. I would like to invite everyone to ask questions in terms of and also share your experiences on this topic as well. Maybe just a question or a comment, or we can all discuss. For example, I just participated at RGS conference last week, and there's a session really talking about carrying infrastructure, and I think three of you the talks is really provide to stimulate people to think about public transport beyond commuting. It's just not about taking A to B. There are many needs, women's, parents, children, and different type of different age group of people, and I think that your research has been really provide toolkits even to think about and how to do it and how to train it or how to argue about it. And I was just wondering, is there any other, this is experience from Australia and Sydney and Melbourne, and I just wonder, is there any other places want to share experiences as well to look at and how it has been done, or actually it's not so active in other contexts? Anyone would like
That
to
was my
share?
question for Nicole as well, because I know that the book, I've read the book, it's a really nice book. And I know it doesn't emerge only from Australian-based research, right? There is a lot of cross-cultural research that you use there. So maybe you could briefly unpack some cultural differences, what happens in Australia versus other countries, some things that struck you as you were collecting
actually, we've worked in undertaken research with women and girls in Sydney and Melbourne, but also in Delhi, Madrid, Kampala, and Lima. And except for Kampala, and that's because you're more afraid of losing your life in Kampala than being sexually harassed. Just that's how it is. There's very little difference between the experiences of women across those 5 continents. Public transport is pretty much the worst public space for women and girls, and the data is incredibly similar. That was one of the hugest things that we found in that original piece of research in 2018. So it is they are relatively global north kinds of cities, but well, not really, actually India's in there, but it's just a universal issue, and we think that it is about the anonymity and the normalization of what women are experiencing in terms of sexual harassment and assault, and we're acculturated into just managing it so that the data doesn't get reported. And yeah, there's if you're privileged enough you can opt out, but often what we're seeing is that women don't and they can't, and here we are.
Thank you. Bettina, you have a question, please?
Yeah, I was just this is really just anecdotal. I don't have any kind of data to back this up, but I think it's worth thinking about. I think that there's often a difference between perceived risk and actual or objective risk. I live in Nottingham in the United Kingdom, Now, we have, for most areas of Nottingham, we actually have, compared to other areas in the UK, really good public transport, frequent, and the central area of Nottingham is well lit. There are always people about. All the sort of examples of bad practice don't really apply. And yet, I've had so many conversations, especially with older women, who say, "Oh no, I wouldn't go into Nottingham city centre. No, that's really dangerous." The perception is, and as far as I'm aware, the group in Nottingham most at risk of violence are actually not older women, they're young men coming out of a nightclub. That's where the risks are.
And
But the
that's absolutely
perceived
true.
risk, because they're women, and maybe because they're older as well, I don't know, added vulnerability perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And I think Kurt probably can talk to this as well, that a young man is actually more at risk of experience violence, a lot more than the random acts of violence that are perpetrated against women, except that those random acts of violence are what kind of do mean that women are constantly managing their behaviour.
Yeah.
But also, I think it is the everyday sexual harassment. Women are constantly managing what could be an escalating incident. And so that is a lot of work. So we don't get to the horrible thing happening because she's managing it all the time and has learned very deftly to do that. So, but you're correct that it is not the demographic that is most at risk. I don't know, other people may have things to say. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. TPU, please.
Yeah, hi, this is Tanu Priya Uteng. I'm based in Oslo at the Institute of Transport Economics, and I've been working with gendered mobilities for quite some time now. And in the chat, I have put the link to a tool we developed for Africa. It's called She Can tool. And I think it's quite relevant for this discussion we have had here. And although this is for Africa, but it's quite relevant, as Nicole was also saying. I mean, this topic is not exclusive to any one country or continent. It's pervasive. And when you look up the numbers, I mean, even in Scandinavia, which is quite an egalitarian society for gender equality, it persists. And there was also a comment on perceived safety. I think when you look at, there are very few studies done on how perceived safety affects women's life chances. And out of these few studies, there's one from India, Delhi, that smart women actually forgo good opportunities for both employment and education because of perceived safety, because the public transport route to the good colleges is perceived as unsafe. So they opt for the bad colleges. And then, that actually determines your future completely. What kind of job you will get, what kind of progression you will make in your studies. And they have quantified it, and the number is just astounding. I think this was a World Bank study by Girija Borkar. Yeah. So it would be also nice, like great work so far, but what I miss is also like nobody is putting numbers on it, the kind of losses which is being incurred. And the day we start actually putting numbers and showing the kind of losses which is being incurred, we can appreciate the volume of this problem much more, even in economic sense, because in order to talk to engineer and economists who completely dominate the transport world, the moment you show them numbers, it will really make a dent. It's not just a soft topic, it's a very hardcore economic loss. So thank you.
It's great. Thank you very much. I wondered any other questions. It's really fascinated. I think it's a topic really resonate with many different countries in the world, and we all really. I'm really happy that we can share and experiences from Australia, also experiences from UK and from Africa. I think we all have the same questions and the same problems to solve. Yes. Any other questions? Dorina, would you like to say a few words, or Nicole and Kurt? Because today is really the speakers are from Australia, but the question is universal. So I think it's really great to have your time. After the whole day, you are 5 p.m. for you, and for us, it just start the day. And thank you so much. Would you like to say a few final words? And I believe the conversation and the research will continue.
I mean, nothing to add. I feel like the importance of the research is clear here, and I hope we can take these conversations forward with perhaps another webinar and more case studies beyond Australia. But thank you very much to Nicole and Kurt and Chia Lim for organizing, and all the participants.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think thank you so much. I think it's really everybody, participation. The questions are great. Really sharing through these exchanges really valuable. So we have, in principle, hopefully not regular every particular month, but we hope to organize 3 online workshops where we can really share some questions and also some research. And as you can see, with 3 topics together, we can have a broader picture of particular issues. And looking forward to see you in the future. And thank you so much. I think for your time, and our workshop today will end here. If you would like to revisit it, it will be posted online. We have a channel where you can go back to look at it. So
Thanks, Chia-Lin. Thanks,
thank you so
Dorina.
much, everybody. And I hope you have a good day afterwards, or a good evening. Keep in touch. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right,
Bye.
everybody.